Hello and welcome to the AAU Talks on AAU TV. We're coming to you live from the Association of African University Studios here in East Legon. My name is Sedi Quashigah. You can catch us live on our Facebook and YouTube channels. Today we'll be discussing the higher education space in East Africa. To help me with this discussion, I have a member of the Inter-University Council for Higher Education in East Africa. I will introduce him to you after a short break. Please stay tuned.
DJ Tronky.
To fight this war without weapons, and I wanted it bad, but there were so many red flags, and another one bites the dust. Now let's be clear, I trust no one. You did not break me. I'm still fighting for peace. Well, I've got thick skin and an elastic heart, but your blade, it might be too sharp. I'm like a rubber band until you pull too hard, but I may snap when I move close. You won't see me fall apart, 'cause I've got an elastic heart. I got an elastic.
Back. As I said before the break, today we are discussing higher education in East Africa. And with me to discuss this topic, I have Professor Mike Kuria, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Inter-University Council for East Africa. Prof, welcome.
Thank you very much.
So to get started, I would just like you to give us an idea of what the Inter-University Council for East Africa does.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. The Inter-University Council for East Africa is an institution of the East African community. The East African community is a community that brings together 6 member countries. Historically speaking, the East African community started in 1967. When it started, it had only 3 countries. It was Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. But in about 2000, it came back after having collapsed in 1977. And then when it came back, 2 other countries joined, Rwanda and Burundi. And recently, we have been joined by South Sudan. So we have 6 countries. And the way the East African community works is that it works by institutions. So there are different institutions that are responsible for different things. So we have one, for example, that is responsible for science and technology, ISDECO. We have one that deals with aviation, we call it CASOA. We have one that deals with the Lake Victoria, for example, we call it LVBC. And we have one that deals with higher education, and that is the Inter-University Council for East Africa.
Okay, so what is the purpose for setting up such an institution?
A good question. The Inter-University Council for East Africa was established. In one line, you would say it was to advise partner states on higher education, on the future of higher education in the area, on the trends in higher education. So in other words, we are supposed to advise the partner states. That is in a very short summary. But if you want to elaborate it a little bit more, I would say 3 things. Number 1 is to help the universities in East Africa to work together. But not just work together themselves, but also to work with universities outside East Africa, even outside Africa. So networking is one of the central cores of the Inter-University Council for East Africa. The second one is research. We are supposed to support the universities in the region to focus on research that meets the needs of the region. And the third thing is quality. So we're supposed to focus on the quality of higher education in the region. So in summary, otherwise there are quite a number of functions that are stipulated in a legal document called the IUCEA Act, which was enacted by the Legislative Assembly in the region. It's called the East African Legislative Assembly.
Okay. So can you just give us some achievements of your institution so far since it started working?
I think the major achievement of the Inter-University Council for East Africa is the fact that in May 2017, the region was declared a common higher education area. What that means is that it becomes a common higher education area in the same way that we have a European common higher education area. Practically what that means is that people studying within the East African region will get degrees that allow them to move around the community, and that if they move from one university to another one, they get their qualifications recognized without much trouble. So there are various documents that the Inter-University Council for East Africa helped to develop. One of them is what we call the East African Higher Education Qualification Framework, that shows what kind of qualification one should have at certain levels. We have about 10 levels there, all the way from nursery school, if you like, to university level. And that document was developed by the Inter-University Council for East Africa. This declaration was made by the heads of state. And for them to do that, there were certain things that the Inter-University Council had to have done. And so I would say in recent times, that's probably one of the major achievements. That doesn't mean that we have arrived there at the common higher education area. We are still working on it, and it's still the responsibility of the Inter-University Council for East Africa.
Okay, so what is the IUCEA coming to the AAU for? Is there any plans for collaboration of or anything of the sort?
Yeah, actually there are two things I would say that brought us to the AAU, and one of them is collaboration, as you say. We see the AAU as an umbrella organization for the whole of the region. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, our focus is the East African community. But then I mentioned that one of our responsibilities is to network universities with other universities outside. So collaborating with the AAU is a good idea because it helps us to see the ways in which universities in East Africa can collaborate with universities outside East Africa. You're probably aware that AAU is the regional facilitator for the African Centers of Excellence. And in a similar way, the Inter-University Council for East Africa is a regional facilitating unit for the Centers of Excellence in the Eastern and South African region. So I think this just goes to say that the many things that AAU is doing are quite related to the many things that IUCEA is doing. So that's one of the areas in which we think we can collaborate on. But even more than that is to say, we have looked at higher education in Africa and East Africa in particular, and seen there are some concerns that we are concerned with. And one of them is leadership and the capacity in the universities for leadership. It is true we have great leaders in many of the universities, but at the same time we have new and upcoming leaders who are getting into positions of leadership without much experience, without any particular training. They are experts in their own fields of scholarship, but they are not trained. And we know that the AAU has done one or two such capacity buildings, and we think that maybe in the future that could be one area we could collaborate on. But there are many areas that we could collaborate on, and I'm glad that it does appear that AAU is quite willing to work with us in that direction.
Okay, that's good to hear. Is the IUCEA involved in any of the developments of the continental frameworks strategies for higher education in Africa?
Absolutely. I think you are probably aware of something called HAQUA. It is an initiative that is trying to harmonize education in Africa, and specifically looking at the process of accreditation. And our IUC has participated in that particular process. We see ourselves as part and parcel of any initiative that is aimed at improving the quality of higher education in Africa. And so, mention it, we are interested in it, and we are making contribution, and HAQUA is just one of the examples.
So for these types of strategies and frameworks, do you wait for your institution to be contacted by, let's say, the AU, that maybe they want to come up with a certain strategy, so they want to get your thoughts on it, or there are some things that you as an institution come up with and then you put them out to these development partners?
We do come up with things that, let me first of all say, as I said a little bit earlier, as IUCEA, we are responsible for the strategic direction of higher education in East Africa. But what you find is that the strategic direction of higher education in East Africa is inextricably linked to what is happening in other parts of Africa. So if, for example, we talk about the accreditation that we're talking about, the quality of higher education, the issues of leadership, problems of leadership in universities, it's a common problem for all of us. And so when we initiate it in the region, we don't necessarily see it as an isolated case. We are also in talks with our colleagues from this side and even from the Southern African side, from West African side. So we see the integratedness, if you like, of the processes that we do. And so we don't necessarily wait that that initiative comes from outside. We also want to look at what we want to do and want to initiate that particular process ourselves and focus on it. I just mentioned a little bit earlier that one, when you asked about what why we are here, for example, and collaboration was one of them. The other thing that we are looking at is how universities and institutions are managing data from higher education institutions. And we want to see how that is happening here in West Africa and continent-wide, because we would like to borrow from best practices so that we are able to advise our partner states with data that is current, reliable, accessible. Okay. And that's an issue that, although there are some other initiatives that in other places that are also particularly coming up, but it's something that we want to spearhead ourselves, at least for our region, from IUCEA.
Okay, when you speak of data, do you refer to things like the number of students, number of faculty, or data as in the research that is done in these institutions that we have here in Africa?
Both.
Both.
we want to look at data that is related to higher education in a very wide spectrum. So we want to see, for example, in what areas are we training people up to PhD level?
Okay.
To what extent are women, for example, participating in higher education in certain specific fields? We want to see what are the needs for engineers, for example, and are your universities prepared enough to produce those kinds of engineers in that particular space of time? But in order to do that, we do need to be able to see what is happening on the ground. And in order to know what is happening on the ground, you need data. But that also means even research comes in. We want to see what kind of research activity is taking place in the universities, and is this research related to the problems that we are seeing on the ground, so that we can be able to advise in terms of focus, whether it's areas of research or even of training. And as you know that when you talk PhD programs, for example, master's programs, you are also talking about research. These guys must be doing research or must be geared towards meeting particular needs in the society through research.
Okay, but it's common knowledge that a lot of research is done in Africa, in our institutions, for example, but this research doesn't translate into solving some of these problems that we have. Why is that so?
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why we need the data. That's why we need to look at, are people really doing research that is related to the problems that are facing the society? Because you would imagine, if someone comes with a certain innovation after a certain research, and that innovation is hitting at a particular issue in society, why is that research not being translated to practical solutions in the society? So we need to look at that. What are people researching in? When they research, where are these documents going? Where are they housed? Who has access to them? And sometimes, actually, to be honest with you, there are some good research that is done in African universities, but it is not disseminated as it should be. Maybe because we don't have that particular kind of practice. So that's why I think when we collect data, we have to look at data in a very wide spectrum and look at the issues that are there in the region. Because I believe that there are some very good researches that have been done in African universities, and if they were disseminated well enough, they would have greater impact. But also, sometimes one of the reasons why that is not happening is because there isn't a good link between universities and industry. Okay. So the guys in industry, for example, in pharmaceutical farms, are not aware that someone in a certain university has done a research that is touching on a particular disease, for that matter. And therefore, this is one of the focus that at Inter-University Council we are really looking at, to see how we can link universities and industry. And that is why every year now we are holding what we call APPF. Okay. By APPF we mean Academia Public-Private Partnership Forum, where we are trying to bring universities and industries in one place, so that industries can say, look, this is what we are looking for. Is it there in the universities? The universities can say, yeah, we can actually provide that. We have the researchers who can do that, and so that they can work together. So hopefully, if we do that, there is going to be greater relationship between the research in the universities and the industry.
Okay. Can you tell us some of the stakeholders that you work with? Like the probably the African Union, maybe EU, those kinds of.
At IUCEA, we have worked with some key stakeholders. One of them is the DAAD, that's German Academic Exchange Services. We worked with them for a very long time, actually, to try and develop tools for related to quality assurance. And I think some of the tools we developed in that collaboration with them translated into East Africa being declared a common higher education area. Okay. Another partner that we are working with quite closely is the World Bank. With the World Bank, it would be the African Centers of Excellence. And recently we have started to work on something that is on a project that is looking at skills for regional transformation at a middle level. So we call them East Africa Skills for Transformation and Regional Integration Program. And that is not looking at degree level. It is looking at TVET, Technical and Vocational Education. That's a partnership that we have between ourselves and the World Bank. But also regionally, at home, we work with organizations like East African Business Council, and that is one institution that we have worked with before to try and link us with industries. So the APPF I mentioned a little bit earlier, whenever we hold it, this East African Business Council helps us to link with the industry. We have also worked with an organization in Kenya called APHRC, that is African Population Health Research Council. And this one we have worked on a project looking at postgraduate supervision to try and build the capacity of postgraduate supervisors. So in other words, what I'm saying is that there are many people that we have worked with, and even the AAU, we may not have done a program directly yet, but we have a memorandum of understanding, and we are going to work on it. But that's one of the reasons why we are here, so that we can see whether there are some areas where we can work together. And I believe we have identified some areas.
Okay. Could you just take us through the roles you play in regulating higher education in East Africa?
Well, that's a good question. We don't actually have a responsibility to regulate higher education. In other words, we don't have a power, for example, to accredit a program or accredit an institution or deny a university accreditation, or an institution for that matter. We don't have that power. That power in East Africa is given to the national regulatory agencies in each of the countries. Okay. So if you go to Tanzania, for example, you'll find a body called Tanzania Commission for Universities. That is responsible for regulating education in Tanzania. But now, how we work with them. The IUCEA is an institution of the East African community. All these regulating bodies are members of the Inter-University Council for East Africa. So when we are developing standards and guidelines for the region, these bodies are all represented. So basically what we do is that what we develop at a regional level, the responsibility of implementing those things in the particular nation states is the responsibility of these national regulatory agencies. And that's how we work together. So we don't regulate directly ourselves, but I think we contribute to the regulation of the same in that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now let's talk about membership. Is there any particular criteria that an institution would need to meet before they can be a member of the Inter-University Council?
Yes, we have a criteria, and the most significant of which is that that university must be recognized by the National Regulatory Agency. So I think you see now how we are working together. So for them, when there is a form where they fill all the details, and they have to show us this is the university, this is our focus, this is the number of students, these are the programs that we run, and then this is our status of accreditation. That status can be interim. There are some universities that have something called a letter of interim authority. When you have that kind of thing, we don't admit you to be a full member of IUCEA. We admit you as an associate member of IUCEA. When you have accreditation, full accreditation, then you become a full member of the Inter-University Council for East Africa. And so that is the connection between us and the regulating agencies, and that's the process of becoming a member of IUCEA.
Are there any benefits that members derive from being a part of the council?
Absolutely. There are many benefits. Sometimes not always understood, but there are many benefits. Let me give you two, for example. Number one, we organize what we call staff mobility program. The staff mobility program is aimed at enabling staff members from one university to go to another member university. So let's say, for example, you are a university which is a member, and in one particular term you have a course that is very skilled, but the person who is very skilled in that area is in another university. You want to bring that person to your university to just be with you for about 3 months or for a term and teach that particular course and maybe others. You invite that person to your university, and we as the Inter-University Council for East Africa will pay for that person's flight, and we'll give him an allowance for the period of time that he's there. And therefore, we will have supported him to be in your university and to support your university. That's one of the benefits that you get. Of course, the other one benefit would be that all these tools that we develop for enhancing the leadership or quality or supervision, all these activities, when we run them, our members benefit from them. I must they put a rider there, though, that some of those benefits also go to universities that are not our members. Because as far as being an institution of the East African community, we are not responsible for only universities that are members of IUCEA. However, there are some areas where universities that are members, first of all, get the benefit. One of the reasons why they might actually reap benefits from that is because they are in our mailing list. So as soon as this kind of activities come up and we send the information, they're the first ones to receive it. So basically, these are some of the benefits that you get out of being a member of the Inter-University Council for East Africa. But it also means when we are building capacity, for example, we are training quality assurance officers, we are training leaders, we are training postgraduate supervisors, members of IUCEA benefit.
Okay, so these institutions that are not exactly members that benefit from some of these perks that these member universities get. Is it in a bid to get them to join up with the council, or it's just let's say the cost of doing business, that they also would benefit in some ways from?
No, they benefit because, as I said, the Inter-University Council is an institution of the East African community. We are funded by contributions by partner states. So if a country has made a certain contribution to support IUCEA, they wouldn't like to hear that then at the same time you have denied service to some of the universities that are in their country. However, what we do is that there are some activities that are funded by the contributions of member universities. So if such an activity is funded by the contributions of the members, then if you are a non-member and you don't get it, you shouldn't complain.
All right. Okay, viewers, let's go for a quick break, and when we come back, we shall continue with the discussion. Please stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. In case you are just joining us, we have Professor Mike Kuria, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Inter-University Council for East Africa. And we are discussing the higher education space in East Africa. Okay, so Prof, according to your website, one of your main roles is to facilitate the strategic development of member universities. How do you do this?
Yeah, I think probably the more accurate thing is that we are helping to facilitate the strategic development of higher education in the region. But of course, as you will understand, if you do that, then it's also going to be contributing to the strategic development of higher education in each of the member universities. One of the ways we do that is, first of all, the data we are collecting now. And that data will be available for the universities who become who are members of Inter-University Council for East Africa, or rather, actually, universities who are in the region. But the second one is when we link universities together in terms of networking. We link them on certain areas. So, for example, the project I mentioned a little bit earlier, it was aimed at quality assurance. So in other words, we just wanted that one of the strategic priorities for universities would be quality of higher education. And so when we contribute to such an activity, we are basically orienting universities to become universities that focus on the quality of the products they have, be it in teaching and learning, in research, or community development. And I mentioned again that one of the next thing we want to focus on is on the quality of leadership. Yeah? We want a dynamic, transformative, visionary leadership in the universities. Now, again, for that to happen, we at the Inter-University Council for East Africa will look at the ways in which we can build that capacity by harnessing skills or contributions from within and outside. That's why we can come to AAU and say, do you have a good strategist for higher education? And we bring that person to the East African region, then bring vice chancellors together, and they sit down and think, where do we want to take our universities in the next 5, 10 years, for example? What kind of leadership do we need in those universities? So when we do that, again, we contribute to the strategic direction of the higher education in the region, and hopefully also in the particular institutions. Because as I said, the Inter-University Council does not exist without the universities. And so if we think about the strategic direction of higher education in the region, we must involve the universities. Sometimes we have to do a little bit of a survey to find out what are the difficulties that are in the region that we need to look at, and then we address them. And that is how we contribute to the strategic development of the universities.
Speaking of the development of higher education, there's this perception that higher education outside of Africa is very well developed. Is shall I say, better than it is here in Africa. Is there anything that these institutions outside of Africa do that probably we are not doing here in Africa?
First of all, I would like to differ just a little bit with that statement. I mean, people who think that higher education in Africa is of a lower quality than universities from outside, that really is not my experience. My experience is that in any part of the world, there are some good universities and maybe some not so good universities. And the issues that we are struggling with in Africa are the very same issues that they are struggling with in other parts of outside Africa. But it is true, there are some universities outside Africa that are doing very well. Say, for example, in research. You go and find in some countries they have really worked out how to link with industry. And therefore, you find that industry is supporting research in the specific institutions. And we in Africa need to find out how we can reach out to these industries which are in the region and how they can work with the institutions. So there are some things that some institutions from outside Africa are doing better than us, and we should feel comfortable to borrow from them. But I think there are also some things that we are doing quite well in East Africa and which we can share with the rest of the world. And that's why I think that the issue of networking would be in a way that enables that it's a win-win situation. They benefit and we benefit. There are certain areas where maybe we are doing better than they are doing, and there are certain areas that they are doing better than we are doing, and we should borrow from each other.
Okay. So how can we raise that perception of African universities in the minds of a lot of the African youth? Because a lot in Ghana, for example, after senior secondary school, we find a lot of our students going to continue their education outside in the Cambridges and those schools that have these worldwide reputations. So what can we also do here in Africa so that instead of going outside Africa, we can be moving within Africa?
I think that's a very good question, because we really do need to think how we make education in Africa attractive. One of the things that I think we have to do and focus on is the focus on quality. When I say that, there are two things here. There's quality and quality assurance. Quality, you might have it, but then do the people out there who are your stakeholders know that you have that quality? So what I'm saying is that we in Africa must make sure that the education that we're offering is up to standard. So where we are a bit lower than other universities from outside the region, we need to raise the bar. But at the same time, we need to be able to engage our stakeholders so that they can see the quality that we are releasing into the market, be it in terms of the graduates or research and that kind of a thing. That brings me back to what I said at the beginning, that there are some good research that have happened in the East African region or even in the other parts of the rest of Africa, but that has not gotten outside. So if you look at journals, for example, research journals, for example, peer-reviewed journals, you find that many of those journals are located outside Africa. And I think we in Africa have to ask ourselves whether we shouldn't do more to make sure that there are journals on the continent of Africa where researchers from the continent of Africa are comfortable to publish in, so that people from outside can come and read those journals and find out the research that has been done and make reference to that research from outside. And then they begin saying, hang on a minute, there's some very good research coming out of the African region. But what you find now, because of that attitude that you mentioned, is that when an African researcher makes a certain discovery, he doesn't want to publish it in a journal that is in Africa. He wants to publish it in a journal that is outside, because that journal from outside is seen as a bit higher than the journals in Africa. So we in Africa must focus on making sure that the journals in Africa have a good reputation. That of course might mean bringing top scholars on the editorial board, bringing the top scholars on the reviewing board, so that the profile of those journals is raised. And I think if that happens, then we begin to see that the products coming out of Africa are good, for that matter. But the next thing also is also to benchmark our programs with some of those universities from outside. First of all, ensure that we indeed measure up, because I think it's good, as you mentioned, not to just assume that we are good, but to be able to say we are good to this particular extent. So a program from the University of Ghana can be put side by side by a program from the University of Harvard, or one of those universities that we think are great, and we look at the program where they are the same, or at least of the similar standard. Then we look at the faculty who are teaching in that particular university and the faculty that are teaching on that side, and we see that there are similarities in that way. Then our graduates begin to leave from our universities. They go to some of the, that, by the way, I think is already happening. You will find that many students coming from African universities, they go to some of these universities abroad and they excel.
Yeah.
Why do they excel? They excel because they were well prepared in a good African university. But I think we need to also work on that attitude, so that people start thinking a bit differently and seeing that there is good quality in Africa, and not always thinking that quality can only come from outside.
Okay. I know that to gain some level of promotions from doctorate from being called a doctor to being called a professor, you have to publish in some of these peer-reviewed journals. and as you said, some of these foreign ones are seen to be of a higher quality. Will it help if some of these criteria in our African universities are, shall I say, reduced slightly, so that our very own professors and doctors are not always striving to have to publish in these foreign journals by all means? Do you think that could help, or would that have a negative effect on the quality that our lecturers can give us?
I don't think we need to lower the standards. The standards should stay the same. But what is the standard? That's the question. So the quality of the article that makes you be made a professor should not change. The quality of that article should be the same. But where must that quality be found? Must it be found in a journal published in Europe? So that's why I said that the first thing is, first of all, we improve the quality and profile of, let me just give a good example. Research that is touching on issues in Africa. Why should that research that is touching on issues on Africa be published in a journal that is outside Africa, even when the research was carried in Africa by Africans? So we need to ask ourselves, why is that happening? And maybe that is happening because, first of all, we have not raised the profile of the journals that we have to that high level quality. So we must focus on it. We can't just ask people to publish in a journal that is not recognized, that doesn't have the kind of profile that it needs. But we must remember that every journal that you see well established from another part of the world, at one particular time, it started.
Yeah.
So if we want a good journals in Africa, at one particular time, they must start. But we want to look at when they start, how do they start? Who starts them? Who is on the editorial board? Who is reviewing these articles? How do we know that these articles measure up? And once we do that and those articles begin to come there, then what we need to do is to find a parameters that are able to assess the quality of that particular publication. And then we have the people who are supposed to be granting promotion. That might be the accrediting agencies, that might be the universities themselves. They begin also to recognize the significant contribution of these journals coming from Africa. We must start to do that. And if we start to do that, we are going to start also seeing people who are from outside Africa, who do research in Africa, publishing in journals located in Africa.
Okay, Prof, let's move on to unemployability and underemployability of African graduates. This is becoming a trend, shall I say, especially in Ghana. You finish university, you can't get a job. And just like to know, is it because of the education that we receive? Is it that the kind of education that we are receiving is not up to scratch? Or is it because we are not collaborating with industry well enough to be able to craft the programs that we are coming up to suit the needs that industry has?
I would say it's a combination of all those. And let me just begin first of all. Sometimes people look at the unemployment of graduates and they immediately say it's the universities that are not doing their job. They're training the people who can't find employment. But I think that sometimes that misses the mark. Because let's say you train an engineer, but there isn't enough money to construct buildings and things like that. Where is that engineer going to work? It doesn't mean that the engineer is not well trained. It doesn't mean he doesn't have the skills. It just means that the economy is not producing the kind of environment where investment in construction takes place. So the first thing I would say, we need to look also at whether the economy is strong enough, is growing strongly enough to be able to produce particular jobs. However, that's why I said the combination of all of them. Sometimes you find that there's a mismatch. We have employment opportunities and we have graduates, but these graduates are not trained in this areas of employment. So that's a mismatch. Again, that does not necessarily mean that those guys who trained in those fields are not quality graduates. They are quality graduates, except that they are not quality graduates for this particular field of training. And I think that's where, in my view, we also need data so that we begin to see trends, for example, to predict what's going to happen in the future and train the kind of graduates that would fit in this kind of industries. So in order to deal with the mismatch, we do need to, as universities, to revisit back when we are starting new programs. We need to see whether those are the kind of programs that will lead to employment. That's the other one. But then again, we might also say the link between universities and industry has been a bit weak in Africa. Universities have kind of been there training graduates, and industries are there doing their thing. But what we are saying is that the industries and universities need to come together, and so that even universities can, the industry can provide opportunities for graduates for internship, to work there for a bit of time, so that by the time they are graduating, they have skills that enables them to work in the industry. At the same time, also at the universities, we also have to think about the kind of graduates that we are training. These days, things are changing pretty fast. If you train in one particular field and you train the skills for the skills that are there in the market today, by the time you are graduating, those skills have changed. But if you are a graduate who was trained to know that you are only learned how to learn, so that when you get to the industry, you know, learning has not stopped. I don't know whether in Ghana that used to happen, but a long time back home in my country, students would finish high school or whatever, and they burn books.
Yeah.
Say education has ended. We are finished. And they did that because they didn't realize that learning is a continuous thing. So we must also address the minds of our graduates so that there's a paradigm shift. Some graduates trained in certain fields, then they go home, they just sit down as if the job must be created in the area that I was trained in. This mind must change. Yeah. So that they begin to think that, no, I can adapt, I can change. Let me give you a good example. When I was teaching somewhere in Nairobi, Kenya, and I interacted with a good friend of mine who was a chemistry teacher. Then I went to do my PhD in the UK, and I found this teacher had gone back to the UK. He was about maybe nearly 70 years old, and he had changed completely from being a mathematics chemistry teacher to a teacher who was developing online content for universities. You can see the transformation. He went there and studied again and learned a completely different field, and began to help universities to build content. But here we have a young graduate who has graduated in a certain area, but sitting at home waiting for a job to come up only in the area in which they were trained. And maybe that's where we need to think about how we train graduates, and think about how we broaden the way we train graduates, so that graduates are trained in a broad sense, and they are also shaped in their mind to know that learning is lifelong. It doesn't end.
Okay. Unfortunately, it seems we've run out of time. But do you have any last words for these young graduates, as we can refer to them, before we wrap up?
Thank you very much. We have run out of time, as you say. But maybe just a quick one, just emphasize what I've just said. And this is not just for the young people, but even for us who are in higher education. Sometimes we are making a mistake of orienting students to very unique skills, and yet the world is such that it needs multiple skills. So I would tell the graduates that when you're in the university, don't ignore some of those areas of training that don't seem to be directly related to what you are doing. Say, for example, you are doing journalism, and someone tells, come to a statistics class, and you ask, what am I going to do with the numbers? I'm supposed to be speaking to people, I'm supposed to be writing stories, why are you inviting me to a statistics course? But the truth of the matter is, once you graduate, maybe you'll be in a position where you are called upon to interpret statistics for an audience that doesn't understand statistics. And as a journalist, you need to do that. And the same case applies to a guy who is studying engineering. And maybe he's going to become a structural engineer or whatever kind of an engineer that may be. And he might think that he doesn't need history. But when he graduates, he discovers that before he can construct a certain building in a certain place, he must understand the history behind that particular place. So this kind of things, I think, need to be put in the minds of graduates, and so that we can have an all-rounded kind of education, and then we are not fixed in one particular place, maybe not even fixed in one particular geographic area. So if you are trained, for example, you think you're only going to be employed in Ghana, open your mind, the world is big.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Professor Mike Kuria, for making the time to join us.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Viewers, we've been discussing the higher education space in East Africa, and we've had Professor Mike Kuria of the Inter-University Council for East Africa with us on the show. I hope you enjoyed the discussion, and we'll see you again next time.